Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you so much to Anders and Daniel for inviting me to TBS. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I've learned a lot, and the best thing, as they said from the start, was also meeting and talking to you all, not only just here, but in the bar. So, now for something a little bit different. I'm going to talk to you about images, and I'm going to talk about things that happen way before your cortex could kick in. But I'd like to end on a sort of optimistic message that I think the science is now right, that we could have simple tools to do something about it. And I look forward to your views on that. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm also a clinical psychologist. And when we talk to people, we can either talk in words, or the only other way we have of thinking is images. And we've spent decades trying to talk in words, but very little research on images, despite the fact that images evolutionary arose way prior to words and pack an incredible punch. A picture says 1,000 words. And if we think about our local mountain here and the first descent, I just want you to look at the quote in purple, because that's a bit of an image on the descent when it went wrong. And what we notice in these split seconds where we're trying to learn from information is exactly that. It's usually about movement and space and motion and colour. It's very little about words or cognition. It's just moments that are very, very perceptual. And they sort of need to be, because you've got to learn from these moments really quickly. And what the brain's have been built to do is extract really useful bits of perceptual information from the environment, replay them again like a high-speed warning signal, so that when you're in a similar situation, it will override deliberately any of that cortex cognition and try and give you that perceptual and emotional information. And the way it does that is it just picks up an environmental cue. So if you're in a car crash with a red car and you're in London, you might find that a red postbox triggers flashbacks of red car. So it's simple, very perceptual level cues outside our conscious awareness. And the reason we call intrusive memories intrusive is that, well, they're unwanted, but they're also a really interesting aspect of human memory. It's involuntary memory, memory that occurs against our will. And if you think back to literature, the iconic moment is Marcel Proust eating his Madeleine, and then suddenly all the childhood memories come back. Now, that's fine when it's a lovely memory or something useful. But it's less fine when the content of that memory could distract us, particularly in high-performance environments. So if I put someone in the brain scanner and I give them experimental trauma, and that is I make them watch scenes of different trauma, we can actually see that at the very time of watching different trauma unfold, that one person will get an intrusive memory to one moment, say a fireman carrying a baby, and another person will get an intrusion to another moment, the moment of a car collision. But your brain will react differently compared to which intrusion you're going to get. And if I put it through machine learning, I can actually even tell before someone has an intrusion, which intrusion they're going to have, because those intrusions are formed at the time of trauma. They're not something that you choose to have. And if we look in the brain scanner at what happens when you have an intrusive memory, that you see that it's happening in the sensory areas of the brain, so associated particularly with visual and motor cortex. What do we actually experience in our colleagues, our patients, or ourselves when we have an intrusive memory? Well, the first myth about intrusive memories is that they're like they are in Hollywood films. They're not. They're not long video replays and flashbacks at all. They're usually only about 200 milliseconds, probably. After that, it takes longer time. And they're not necessarily the worst bit of the trauma. They might be the moment just beforehand or a bit of perceptual information. So they're brief, they're fleeting, and we'll all have seen it in our colleagues. They often create a little startle response. You could see somebody's eyes change. But basically, they're brief, they're snippets, but they're visual, typically. So to recap, they come back to mind involuntarily. They're sensory-based. They sort of carry, think about them a bit like a capsule, a time capsule. They're carrying tons of information, be perceptual, spatial information, also emotional information. And when you have them, they hijack attention, and you can't think your way out of them. But But what that means is if you have your attention hijacked at a critical moment, whether it's on a climb or in a work situation or a family situation, they can impair your functioning. And particularly if you go back to why they're triggered, you'll usually have a flashback when you've got accused to the same thing. So if somebody, and this is examples with ICU staff, has an intrusive memory of an intubation that failed, they won't have them all that failed, but that particular one, you'll find that any triggers that are reminders, perceptual reminders to that particular constellation of, as it were, visual events, could be the thing that triggers the memory. Now, the memory might be very short, as I said, less than a second, but it's the cascade of responses after that that cause the disruption. So where are we now? And I'm going to try and summarize this very briefly, but we do have good treatments for PTSD, but they're very long, usually about 15 to 20 hours, and they're quite aversive to do and sometimes to administer, as Karina and I were talking about earlier. And we don't have any drugs that work, according to evidence-based guidelines, particularly well. Most of the existing treatments we have are based around single event trauma. They're not based for repeated events, and they're not designed, they haven't been run in studies where there's ongoing trauma. So there's a lack in the evidence base. And they're also not very scalable because they need very highly skilled clinicians like Karina, I'm also a trauma therapist originally, to administer them. And that's despite, we know that if you look at the prevalence studies, that a single event trauma leads generally to about a point prevalence of, say, 4% PTSD in natural disasters, about 50% by the time you get to torture. But it's a not insignificant risk of exposure. Where might we be going? And I understand that's the sort of theme of Zermatt as well. We're thinking about the science and the tools of the future. Well, where I'd like us to be going is something a bit different, just to make it a bit simpler. Actually, there may be very simple tools to help switch off intrusive memories and flashbacks. That we ought to be equipping people with very brief and repeatable tools that restore functioning quite quickly. And what I'd like to discuss now is the idea of something that takes about 25, 30 minutes that could be used in work environments and it involves, as it were, a digital medical device. And I'm curious about the idea that if we protect ourselves against all sorts of other risks, why do we not do simple things for what I would call a brain risk that is actually quite impairing, even though you can't see it from the outside, but you can experience it, anyone who's had intrusive memories, from the inside, or see it in our colleagues. So let's talk a little bit about how neuroscience leads us to do something that I think is going to look really odd when you see it, because it's going to involve playing a game, among other things. But I'm going to try and explain why. So, as we've looked at in the first bit of this talk, when we have intrusive recollections, they're not words. They're sensory-based. They're images. And so what if, unlike talking therapies or the way we've been doing other methods in mental health, we go straight for the image rather than what people are saying, the words? Well, one way we could go for an image is to zap it, zap visual cortex. So I could wire someone up and zap that bit of their brain. We could do that, and if we do that, we can show that we can reduce the potency, the impact of intrusive images very soon after exposing people to experimental trauma just with repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to be suggesting that we zap everyone's brains after trauma exposure. This is proof of concept that something as simple as targeting visual cortex can make a difference to whether that person goes on to have persistent intrusive memories. And why is that persistence important? Well, some people won't have any intrusive memories after trauma. Some will have them for just a couple of days. But what our data shows is that if you have some the first day or so after trauma, they can persist for weeks. If you're working those weeks, they'll be disruptive. But if you've still got them about a month or so later, they can persist for months. And if you've got them at 6 months, they can persist for decades. So you might want to get rid of them. So what other options do we have than something like stimulating electrically visual cortex? Well, The wonderful thing about the brain is there's always all sorts of ways to access it. And one thing you can do is actually give people tasks. So we could use visual processing. Do you know what I mean by mental rotation? No. Okay, so if I showed you my hand like that in a sort of L shape, and I said, could you move it? Just imagine moving it by 90 degrees. Some of you will imagine that. Some of you imagine that. It's the sort of thing you use all your time in your clinical skills. We often have to predict the way a shape moves before we move it. It's useful for packing the car. It's useful for doing surgery. It's an essential part of everyday life. So, but it's something that if I put somebody in the scanner again and make them do lots of mental rotation, what we're doing is using very similar areas of the brain that we use when we have a flashback. Because it's the same sort of visual-spatial part. Think about intrusive memories as visual-spatial information. Now, in this scan, what our participants are doing is we put them in the CAT scanner and we've taught them to play the visual-spatial computer game called Tetris, which is an old game developed by the Russians in the 1980s. And what you get in this game is blocks that come up on the right-hand side. And they move, and you can rotate them and put them into places to create lines. And so what master Tetris players do is they actually do a lot of mental rotation on those blocks before they go down. If you're a junior Tetris player, you just swipe away on your iPhone. This is not going to work. What you have to do is take those blocks and imagine exactly where to place them, which is about doing mental rotation again and again and again. And we get people to do that for about 20 minutes. And why is that interesting? Well, it's because if we activate a trauma image, albeit very briefly, and I'll come on to that in a second, and we get people to do a mental rotation task, in this case in the digital platform, it's by scaffolding that mental rotation with a game, our brain is like a limited capacity processor. You can't do two things in the same modality at once. So you can't actually listen to me and write about something different on your phone, because you'll either be doing the writing or the listening. But same with visual stuff. I can't visually rotate the blocks and restore into memory a very vivid image. So we're just competing for resources and trying to save that hyper-acute image that flashes back into a weaker form. Why is that interesting? It's less likely to be triggered by other visual stimuli in the environment. What will happen the next day? Well, in our data, which I'm going to show you in a second, most people's intrusive memories, if they've been able to do the full procedure for 25 minutes, will stop intruding. So, just to take home, I won't go into all the details here, but it's not just playing the game. I wish I could just send you all away and say, go play Tetris. It isn't. It is having to go through a procedure in a digital platform, we'll go through in a second, which is about 3 steps, of which this is the last step. And it's also not something that we came up with overnight. It makes me realize that science is built on lots of little studies. So this was about doing tons of, I don't know how many even, experiments in the lab first, trying to work out how many seconds we needed of this, what worked, what didn't work, what makes intrusive memories worse, all the different parameters that we then put into a task procedure, which looks extremely simple. But it's built on a lot of experiments. And so it's not just playing Tetris, and just to repeat, Tetris alone will not work. I think I've got that message. So, the version I'd like to talk to you about is one that we worked on in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we call it an imagery competing task intervention because the mechanistic basis, basically. But we've put it here. We're not going to be running it. All of our original work had been done face-to-face, but obviously with what's it called in English, contagion risks and so on and so forth, it's much better to have something in a digital platform. And so what does it look like? So I'm working with colleagues outside Oxford, a company called P1 Vital, and we've built a secure digital platform. That's very important. And so you'd log in, you get a user code, and the platform will guide you through what to do. Because most people, to treat an intrusive memory, you need to follow and be scaffolded through the procedure. So this is the intervention. And there's 3 basic components here. And this is what you do, and this is why you do it. So the steps are very, very briefly, and I mean briefly, nothing like normal trauma therapy for psychology. So a couple of seconds, bring to mind the image. And note, you do not have to talk about the trauma, and you do not have to tell the person guiding you, if you're doing it with somebody else, what you're even seeing. But you type it into the platform just in no more than 6 or 7 words. We then teach people to use mental rotation, which is an interesting skill. Improve your car packing, if nothing else. So we teach people to use mental rotation. And after we've done that, we get them to keep doing that task, which is hard work, but for about 20 minutes, using Tetris as a way to practice doing mental rotation with all the different blocks coming up. So picture, pivot, play, scaffolded through, walked through by the digital system, which starts you off and finishes you, and make sure that you does everything on the right timings. So we did it in the pandemic because we were involved with colleagues that were trying to think about what mental health things we need to do in the pandemic. And of course, most people will not necessarily suffer from PTSD after a difficult event, but the rate of trauma exposure was just going up and up. And so we flagged the need for different interventions than the ones we have today with people with repeated trauma exposure. And we know by about the first few months of the pandemic, about 30% of people reporting questionnaire studies, this is work in the UK, reporting symptoms consistent with PTSD diagnosis. So we teamed up with the Intensive Care Society, funded by the Wellcome Trust, and the study's called GAINS. And unlike most mental health trials, I'm not interested in a whole psychiatric disorder. That's a whole discussion for another time. I'm just interested in symptoms that people can self-identify, so it doesn't need to go through referral via a clinician. That's a big barrier for a lot of people accessing interventions and tools for mental health. But to self-diagnose, knowing what intrusive memory is, and people can take part if they're having at least 3 a week. Now, the other rule that we broke, apart from being a trial that focused on just one symptom, is that we didn't run it like normal frequentist trials. I was lucky to be working with Charlotte Summers in Cambridge and also Thomas Jackie, who were working on the recovery trial, and following the work around Bayesian adaptive design. So we're also really pleased to be the first mental health trial, to our knowledge, and working with a mathematician friend in Oxford, Mike Bonzel, and also with Julie Highfield, who's wonderful at the ICS, coming together and designing a trial in a different way. And to cut to the bottom line about Bayesian adaptive trials, which I think would be fantastic in all the areas that we're working on here, it's really good when you're trying to optimize and do things very quickly, and you want to keep N down. So you're basically saving about half the number of participants that you need to run through a trial. And in the interest of time, I won't go through all the details, but if anyone wants to talk about them later, I'd be delighted to. And in this trial, we've got mostly nurses, all working in ICU. They came in with a baseline of over 35 work-related traumas that they self-say are traumas. So obviously most work isn't, but ones where they said, this is the bit where we're wrong. They don't have to tell seniors or colleagues that they're taking part. It's self-referral digitally. And they get one guided session with, as it were, a bit of a digital navigator. This is how the system works, walk through it. I think that was useful in our trials. I don't think everybody necessarily needs that, but this is the data I'm showing you. So this intervention is one session. And after that, someone's learned how to use this procedure. So if there's a new trauma or another flashback, they can log in themselves and self-administer. We just gave people that option and saw what happened. So this is the slide that I'm so delighted to show you. And on the y-axis, we've got the number of intrusive memories that week. And I've include all outliers for the maths people in the audience are shown here. And the lines represent individual participants. And we can see that staff are coming in actually with an average of about 14 intrusive memories of trauma per week. And 1 month later, they're leaving with a median of 1. And that you can see that improvement. And then we did a crossover design. So we can see when we then give access to the intervention to the control group, we mirror that pattern of results. That's our primary outcome. What people say, and how that is actually quite interesting, so I want to be open about this. People say, I genuinely did not expect this to work, which I'm sure many of you in the audience are thinking now. And I'm going to show you a bit more data to see if I can change your mind. And I think what's really nice about running the trials is that we can generally say we have a reverse placebo effect. People almost always think our control condition is the real treatment. But there we are. At least it's not placebo. But it's quite simple to use. And what people really like is the fact that these intrusive memories, they can see improvement quite quickly. So there's the Financial Times wrote about this just before Christmas, and they found some people that had taken part that I've never met, and they're all saying the same thing. We didn't think it was going to work. We think we've been put in the wrong condition, but actually, when we did it, it did. We've replicated findings in the second study with a larger sample in Sweden. And what I want to show you in this graph, again, we've got on the y-axis the number of intrusive memories per week at baseline, quite similar, around 15. Even a week later when we measure them, and this is a frequency count diary, we've managed to reduce them quite a lot, maybe to about 3. But a month later, we're seeing that beautiful reduction to only 1 a week. Now, why am I so interested in one symptom? So as a scientist, and I have this tension all the time between being a clinician and being really frustrated about most of our techniques were developed in the 1960s, so why can't we do things differently? So our hypothesis was that if you model intrusive memories, they link really strongly to other symptoms in a network. So if we could zap intrusive memories, the other symptoms should go off too. So that's exactly what we see in our data. So if we zap someone's intrusive memories and they reduce, what that means is that naturally, without having to deal with the avoidance or the sleep or the hyperarousal, at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, people's other related symptoms in the network are also going down, but in a kind of efficient way because you're only having to do one thing. So I like that. And because of we were working with staff, people wanted to put in measures, we've got a lot of PPI in the study, about work, burnout, and engagement. This is actually on a Swedish measure. But what we see is improvements in engagement and burnout at 6 months. We don't see any effect on actual days at work. So to summarize, it's a very brief digital intervention that you have to run through in a digital platform. It's got 3 steps, picture, pivot, play. And we've run it in these trials with a guided session. You use it once per flashback. And you should be able to obliterate that flashback in many, many cases. 2 questions often get, can you use it straight after trauma? Some people start developing things even on the first day. Yes, absolutely. We run 2 trials straight after trauma. And we can see that we do a similar thing. It's about sort of tapping in a slightly differently, but into consolidation processes in memory rather than reconsolidation processes. And can patients use it? Yes. We've run it with patients, but we've given it to patients as they're sitting in emergency departments. So we're not taking them to a separate place. They can still do everything else they're doing, but they're being able to do it on a device whilst they're waiting for other treatments. And in that case, you're giving it to everybody because you don't know who's going to get it, but we see statistically that it helps in terms of preventative symptoms over the longer run. And just before I end, the colleagues in the Ukraine sent me some Ukrainian newspaper coverage of the recent trial that we just published in Sweden before Christmas. I think it was October or November. And so it went into the newspapers there, which I completely agree, unusual way. But what we've just started doing is now getting ethical permission and running an implementation trial for colleagues working in medical hospitals in Ukraine, who are also getting intrusive memories as part of their work. So the question maybe that I would like to pose in a bigger sense is, there is huge resistance to hand washing. We all know the history of that. There is huge resistance to wearing seatbelts. They're things that we take for granted. And TBS sort of encourages this future thinking. For me, it might be, in the decades to come, maybe, what if we thought in high stress, high performance environments, it would be equally outrageous not to give people really simple tools, because we know the mechanisms that can help. Certainly at population level or participant level, but and also definitely at an individual level, just stop the build-up of stuff that you don't want to have. And that can improve not only one's own personal health, but one's functioning. And what I'd love to talk to you about in the coffee break, or in the bar, or in the remaining time that we have in Zermatt, is if you can see ways. I'm really seeking to try and learn next about implementation that you might find it useful in your context. How can we and how do you in your fields translate today's science to tomorrow's practice? Is there any way that you would like to or we can help? And here are my email address and also Jonathan's, which is who I've been working with for the last years on developing the digital platform. So thank you very much for the chance to talk to you, and it's a real pleasure to be here at TBS. Thank you.